The Boeing 777 should not have been where it was. Flight 447, carrying 180 souls from Dubai to London, had deviated 47 nautical miles off course, drifting like a ghost ship through restricted airspace above the Mediterranean. Air traffic controllers in 3 countries had lost radio contact 17 minutes ago. The transponder signal flickered weakly on radar screens, showing an aircraft that shouldn't exist in a place it couldn't be. Captain Nix Callows felt the weight of those 180 lives pressing against her chest as she gripped the yoke of the crippled airliner. Her olive-skinned hands, scarred from ejection training a lifetime ago, trembled not from fear, but from the hydraulic fluid slowly draining from the aircraft's veins. The cockpit reeked of burning electronics and something else, something metallic that tasted like old pennies on her tongue. Through the fractured windscreen, the azure Mediterranean stretched endlessly below, beautiful and merciless. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Emirates 447, she transmitted into the static-filled void. "Total hydraulic failure, flight controls compromised. We are in uncontrolled descent." Her co-pilot, Marcus Webb, a 28-year-old who still believed in aviation miracles, stared at instruments that had become abstract art. Warning lights painted his face in amber and crimson. "Captain, the backup systems aren't responding. We're losing altitude at 3,000 feet per minute." Nix closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, a luxury no pilot could afford, but one she desperately needed. In those 2 seconds, she wasn't Captain Callows of Emirates Airlines. She wasn't the woman who'd fought her way through a decade of commercial aviation, enduring smirks and subtle sabotage from men who believed the cockpit was their kingdom. She wasn't the pilot who'd taken this job because the airlines were safer than what she'd left behind. For 2 seconds, she was Viper 62, call sign that once struck terror into enemy hearts across 3 theaters of war. She was the woman who'd flown F-16s through Syrian surface-to-air missile fields, who'd saved a SEAL team pinned down in the Afghan mountains, who'd earned a distinguished flying cross that now gathered dust in a drawer she rarely opened. The Mediterranean rose to meet them like an old friend with sharp teeth. Somewhere far below, fishing boats traced white wakes across water that would soon become either their salvation or their grave. Time compressed into heartbeats. Physics cared nothing for courage or desperation. The laws of aerodynamics were absolute, unforgiving. But Nix Callows had never been one to surrender to the absolute. She opened her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years she was flying to kill again. Only this time she was hunting death itself. The radio crackled with electronic phantoms, and in the static she thought she heard something impossible, the whisper of jet engines that shouldn't exist. 15 minutes earlier, the first indication of trouble had been subtle, a vibration through the airframe so slight that most pilots would have dismissed it as turbulence. Nix had learned to trust her spine before her instruments. Metal sang different songs when it was dying, and she'd heard this particular melody before, in combat zones where machines were pushed beyond their engineering tolerances. Getting some unusual readings on hydraulic pressure, Marcus had reported, his voice carrying the casual concern of a pilot who still believed aircraft were built to be invulnerable. The readouts showed green across all systems, but Nix's trained eye caught the micro-fluctuations that preceded catastrophic failure. She'd keyed the radio then, her voice steady and professional. "London Center, Emirates 447 requesting immediate clearance to altitude 28,000 and direct routing to nearest suitable airport." The response had come crisp and bureaucratic. "Emirates 447, maintain flight level 35,000. Traffic conflict at 28. Nearest suitable airport is Malta, bearing 270, distance 120 nautical miles." Malta. Nix had landed at Malta's Lucca Airport during her military career, bringing home damaged F-16s that leaked fuel and hope in equal measure. The runway was long enough, the emergency services adequate, but 120 nautical miles might as well have been 1,000. The explosion, when it came, was not the dramatic fireball of Hollywood imagination. Instead, it was a sharp crack followed by a shuddering throughout the airframe, as if some giant had struck the aircraft with an invisible hammer. Hydraulic fluid began painting abstract patterns on the wing surfaces, dark against aluminum skin. The flight controls grew heavy under Nix's hands, each input requiring more force than the last. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, watching instruments cascade into failure. "Captain, we're losing everything." Nix's military training kicked in with mechanical precision. Checklist procedures, emergency protocols, the cold mathematics of controlled flight into terrain. But beneath the professional veneer, something else stirred, a predatory instinct honed by years of combat flying. The aircraft was wounded, yes, but it was still airborne, still fighting. She thought of the 180 passengers behind her, probably unaware of their proximity to eternity. Families returning from vacation, business travelers clutching laptops full of quarterly reports that would never be presented, children pressed against windows watching the world shrink beneath them. Each life was a universe of dreams and fears and unfinished stories. The radio erupted with voices as air traffic controllers across 3 countries scrambled to make sense of the ghost aircraft drifting through their carefully orchestrated sky. Emergency frequencies buzzed with coordination efforts, search and rescue assets spinning up, the vast machinery of aviation safety grinding into motion. But Nix knew the truth that they were only beginning to understand. Rescue was a luxury for pilots who had time. Time was the one resource she couldn't manufacture. The Mediterranean Coalition naval exercise was in its 3rd day when radar operators aboard the USS Roosevelt detected the anomaly. Admiral Sarah Blackwood, commanding the task force from the carrier's bridge, studied the tactical display with the calculating gaze of someone who'd spent 30 years reading the ocean's moods. "Ghost contact, bearing 095, range 80 nautical miles," reported Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, his voice carrying the clipped precision of a man who'd learned to trust his instruments above all else. "Intermittent transponder, civilian identifier, but the signature's all wrong." Blackwood moved to the radar console, her weathered hands gripping the rail. The contact appeared and disappeared like a digitized heartbeat, each ping weaker than the last. Speed: showing 240 knots but descending. Rate of descent is, Jesus, ma'am, that's 3,000 feet per minute. 3,000 feet per minute. Blackwood had watched enough aircraft die to recognize the mathematics of disaster. Whatever was out, there was falling with the inevitability of gravity itself. She thought of the Challenger disaster, of Malaysia 370, of all the times the sky had swallowed aircraft whole and left only questions behind. Distance to nearest land: Malta, 75 nautical miles, but at current descent rate. Rodriguez's voice trailed off into the unspoken conclusion. Blackwood keyed her headset. "Air boss, launch the ready CAP. I want eyes on that contact immediately." The Combat Air Patrol launched with the controlled violence of carrier operations. 2 FA-18F Super Hornets catapulted into the afternoon sky, their twin engines carving contrails against azure infinity. Lieutenant Commander Jake "Hawkeye" Morrison led the formation, his wingman close enough to read the kill markings on his fuselage. 12 confirmed air-to-air victories across 2 combat deployments. Homeplate: Hawkeye flight is airborne, proceeding to investigate unknown contact. Admiral Blackwood watched the tactical display update in real time, the F-18s racing toward a contact that might be nothing more than radar ghosts and atmospheric distortion. But 30 years of naval aviation had taught her to trust her instincts, and her instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong in her patch of Mediterranean sky. The radio crackled with transmissions from Malta Air Traffic Control, their voices tight with controlled panic. A commercial airliner was dying somewhere in their airspace, and they were powerless to do anything but watch the slow-motion catastrophe unfold on their screens. Blackwood had ordered men into harm's way before, had watched aircraft disappear into the night carrying souls she'd never see again. But this felt different. This felt personal, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way the contact flickered on her screens like a dying star, or the knowledge that somewhere in that radar return were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Hawkeye flight, contact bearing 098 12 miles. What's your status? Morrison's voice came back steady and professional. Home plate, we have visual on a heavy commercial, looks like a 777. Single contrail appears to be leaking fluid. Aircraft is in obvious distress. Morrison had seen aircraft die before, fighters pancaking onto carrier decks, transports disappearing into Afghan mountainsides, the mechanical ballet of destruction that defined modern warfare. But there was something uniquely haunting about watching a commercial airliner fight for its life against the inexorable pull of physics. The Boeing 777 hung in the afternoon sky like a wounded albatross, one engine trailing a dark contrail that spoke of internal bleeding. The aircraft's nose was pitched down at an angle that made Morrison's stomach clench, 10 degrees, maybe 12. In a fighter jet, such an attitude might be aggressive maneuvering. In a commercial airliner carrying 180 souls, it was the first verse of a dirge. Home plate Hawkeye 11. I'm seeing significant control surface deflection, full-up elevator, looks like they're fighting hard to maintain level flight. No response to radio calls on guard frequency. Morrison pulled his Super Hornet into a parallel course, close enough to see details that would haunt him later. Through the cockpit windows, he could make out two figures in the front seats, their movements sharp and urgent. The pilot, he could see it was a woman from the silhouette, was wrestling with controls that no longer obeyed the fundamental laws of aviation. Behind the cockpit, passenger windows glowed with the warm light of people unaware they were dancing with eternity. Morrison thought of his sister, who flew commercial routes for Delta, and felt something cold settle in his chest. These were his people, aviators fighting to keep the miracle of flight from becoming a nightmare of physics. Hawkeye 12, take high station and coordinate with Malta Rescue, Morrison transmitted to his wingman. I'm going to try to establish communication. He switched to the international emergency frequency, the one pilots used when all other options had been exhausted. Commercial traffic in distress, this is U.S. Navy fighter, call sign Hawkeye 11. Do you copy? Static filled his headphones like electronic snow. Then, cutting through the white noise, a woman's voice emerged, calm, professional, carrying the kind of authority that came from intimate familiarity with crisis. Hawkeye 11, this is Emirates 447. We have total hydraulic failure, limited flight control authority, 180 souls on board. Morrison felt his breath catch. Something in that voice was familiar, not the words, but the cadence. The way she pronounced total hydraulic failure, like it was a tactical problem to be solved rather than a death sentence to be accepted. He'd heard that particular combination of competence and controlled desperation before. Emirates 447, what's your fuel status and intended destination? Fuel sufficient for 30 minutes flight time. We're trying to make Malta, but... The voice paused, and in that pause Morrison heard the weight of mathematics that didn't lie. We're losing altitude faster than we can cover ground. Morrison did the calculations in his head with the cold precision of a pilot who'd learned that hope was a luxury when physics were involved. The airliner was 60 miles from Malta, losing altitude at a rate that would put them in the water in 12 minutes. Even if they could stretch their glide, the Mediterranean was particularly unforgiving to aircraft that arrived at the wrong angle and speed. Emirates 447, are you familiar with water landing procedures? Another pause, longer this time. When the voice returned, it carried something Morrison had heard in combat zones, the sound of someone calculating odds that weren't in their favor but refusing to surrender to them. Affirmative, Hawkeye, we're working on it. Working on it. The phrase would have been almost funny if not for the circumstances pressing against Nix's chest like a weight that grew heavier with each passing second. Working on it, as if hydraulic failure at 33,000 feet was a problem that could be solved with sufficient determination and engineering expertise. The control yoke felt like it weighed 100 pounds under her hands, each input requiring the kind of physical effort that left her shoulders burning with lactic acid. Marcus had gone through every emergency checklist twice, his young face pale but focused, believing with the stubborn faith of inexperience that there had to be a procedure for this situation. "Captain, I'm showing partial response on the backup hydraulic system," he reported, his voice carrying a hope that Nix couldn't afford to share. "If we can isolate the leak." Negative. Nix's response was sharper than she'd intended, colored by the certainty of someone who'd watched systems fail in combat. "We're losing fluid faster than we can pressurize. Any pressure we build up will be gone in minutes." Through the fractured windscreen, she could see the Navy fighter maintaining formation alongside them, the pilot close enough that she could make out his helmet and oxygen mask. Something about the aircraft's positioning spoke of experience, not the tentative approach of a pilot following protocol, but the confident proximity of someone who understood the delicate balance between helping and hindering a pilot in crisis. The radio crackled with transmissions as air traffic controllers across 3 countries scrambled to coordinate an emergency that was unfolding faster than their procedures could accommodate. Malta ATC was vectoring emergency services to the coastline, their voices tight with the controlled panic of people who were trained to manage disasters, but rarely faced them in real time. Emirates 447, Malta Rescue reports surface wind at 15 knots, sea state moderate. Rescue vessels are moving to intercept point. Intercept point. The phrase made Nix's jaw clench with bitter irony, as if they were planning a rendezvous rather than a controlled crash into 37-degree water that would kill most of her passengers within minutes. She thought of the ditching of U.S. Airways 1549 in the Hudson River, the miracle on the Hudson that had required perfect conditions, perfect execution, and luck that bordered on divine intervention. The Mediterranean in November was not the Hudson River in January. The water was colder, the rescue resources more scattered, the margin for error measured in degrees of impact angle rather than miles of glide distance. But Nix had never been one to surrender to statistics. She thought of her father, General Dimitri Kalos, who commanded Greek Air Force squadrons during the Turkish provocations of the 1990s. He taught her that flying was 10% science and 90% refusing to accept defeat until physics made the decision for you. "The sky doesn't care about your rank or your experience," he told her during her first solo flight. "It only cares about your determination to stay in it." Determination. She had that in abundance, but determination without physics was just well-intentioned suicide. The altimeter unwound like a countdown clock, each 1,000 feet a milestone on their journey toward the inevitable mathematics of impact. Lieutenant Commander Morrison had flown combat air patrol missions over Syria, had threaded his F-18 through surface-to-air missile envelopes that would have reduced lesser pilots to smoking craters. But watching the Emirates 777 fight its slow-motion battle with gravity was a different kind of torture, the helplessness of being witness to a disaster that skill alone couldn't prevent. Home plate Hawkeye 1-1. The Heavy is maintaining controlled flight but continuing descent. I'm estimating. Jesus, they're not going to make landfall. Admiral Blackwood's voice came back steady and professional, but Morrison could hear the weight of command in her tone. "Hawkeye, what's your assessment of pilot competency?" Morrison watched the airliner's control surfaces micro-adjusting in real time, small corrections that spoke of someone who understood the delicate balance between speed and lift, when traditional control authority was compromised. The aircraft's attitude remained stable despite what had to be enormous control forces, the kind of precision that came from intimate familiarity with aerodynamics under duress. Homeplate pilot appears highly competent. Aircraft control is. It's actually pretty impressive given what they're working with. Through his canopy, Morrison could see the woman in the left seat, her posture erect, movements economic and precise. There was something in her body language that reminded him of the best fighter pilots he'd known, the ones who flew like they'd been born with wings and refused to acknowledge that aircraft were supposed to be bound by the laws of physics. His radio crackled with a transmission on the emergency frequency. Hawkeye 11, Emirates 447, can you give us a vector to the nearest ship? Morrison checked his tactical display, overlaying surface contacts with the airliner's projected impact point. Emirates 447, bearing 270, distance 8 miles, I'm showing a large commercial vessel. But, he paused, unwilling to speak the mathematics they both understood. You're not going to make it that far. Copy that, Hawkeye. We're going to try anyway. The transmission was matter of fact, carrying none of the panic or denial that Morrison had heard from pilots facing the impossible. Instead, it carried something that made the hair on his neck stand up, the calm acceptance of someone who'd made peace with long odds before. He'd heard that tone exactly once before, during a mission over Afghanistan when his squadron leader had taken a surface-to-air missile through his port engine and calmly announced his intention to stay airborne long enough to provide cover for a medevac extraction. The squadron leader had died that day, but the medevac had made it home with 6 wounded Marines who were alive because someone had refused to accept the reasonable limits of aviation. Morrison keyed his radio to the carrier. Homeplate, request immediate launch of search and rescue. We're going to need every asset you can get airborne. Already in motion, Hawkeye. Rescue birds launching in 60 seconds. 60 seconds. Morrison did the math and felt his stomach drop. Even the fastest rescue helicopter would need 20 minutes to reach the impact zone, and 20 minutes was about 19 minutes longer than most of the passengers would survive in Mediterranean water. Unless the pilot in that wounded airliner could perform a miracle that had only been achieved once before in the history of commercial aviation. Nix could feel the aircraft dying beneath her hands, not the dramatic destruction of combat damage, but the slow bleeding of a machine that had been pushed beyond its engineering tolerances. The hydraulic system that gave her control authority was hemorrhaging precious fluid with each passing second, and the backup systems were following the same inexorable path toward failure. 28,000 feet and descending. The Mediterranean stretched below them like a vast blue-black carpet, deceptively peaceful from altitude. She knew that water would feel like concrete at the speed they were traveling, that the survival rate for controlled water landings in heavy aircraft was measured in percentages that would make insurance actuaries weep. But she'd beaten statistics before. Marcus, I need you to get on the PA and prepare the cabin for emergency landing, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd given orders that meant the difference between life and death. Full evacuation procedures, life vests, brace positions. Don't sugarcoat it. Her young co-pilot nodded, reaching for the cabin intercom with hands that shook only slightly. In other circumstances, she might have been proud of his composure. Today, composure was just another resource to be managed in the calculus of survival. The Navy fighter maintained position alongside them, close enough that she could see the pilot's helmet tracking their movement. Something about his formation flying spoke of experience that went beyond peacetime exercises, the kind of precision that came from flying in conditions where small mistakes had permanent consequences. She thought of her own military service, of nights spent flying over Syria when the sky was full of missiles, and the margin for error was measured in milliseconds. Back then, she'd been Viper 6-2, part of an international coalition that spent 3 years trying to bring stability to a region that had forgotten the meaning of peace. The call sign had been earned during her third combat mission, when she'd single-handedly destroyed a Syrian radar installation that was providing targeting data for surface-to-air missiles. The radar site had been heavily defended, requiring a low-altitude approach through a valley that channeled anti-aircraft fire like a funnel. She'd gone in alone while her squadron mates provided high cover, threading her F-16 through missile envelopes with the casual precision of someone playing a deadly video game. The explosion when she'd released her bombs had been visible from 30 miles away, a pillar of fire and smoke that marked the end of one more threat in an endless war. But it was the flight home that had earned her the respect of pilots who'd initially doubted whether a woman belonged in a fighter cockpit. Her F-16 had taken shrapnel through the hydraulic lines, leaving her with the same kind of limited control authority she was experiencing now. But she'd nursed that wounded Falcon home through 200 miles of hostile airspace, landing at the coalition base with systems that failed completely 30 seconds after touchdown. Viper 6-2, that was some of the finest flying I've ever seen, her squadron commander had said during the debrief. You just rewrote the book on single-engine hydraulic failure recovery. She'd never told him that the flight home had been pure instinct, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought would have been too slow. The same instinct that was guiding her now. The cabin address system crackled to life with Marcus's voice, professionally calm despite the circumstances pressing against his chest like a physical weight. Ladies and gentlemen, this is First Officer Webb from the flight deck. We are experiencing technical difficulties that will require an emergency landing. Please listen carefully to the cabin crew instructions and prepare for emergency evacuation procedures. Behind the cockpit door, Nix could hear the controlled chaos of 180 people processing the reality of their situation. Some cried, others prayed in languages she didn't recognize, but most simply followed the safety procedures with the mechanical compliance of passengers who trusted their lives to people they'd never met. The chief flight attendant, Maria Santos, had 23 years of experience and the kind of professional composure that came from dealing with every conceivable passenger crisis. Her voice carried through the intercom with the authority of someone who'd learned that leadership in emergency situations was 10% knowledge and 90% projecting confidence you might not feel. Ladies and gentlemen, please locate your life vest under your seat. Put your arms through the loops and secure the waist belt, but do not inflate until you are outside the aircraft. Nix felt the familiar weight of command settling on her shoulders, the responsibility for lives that went beyond mechanical procedures and emergency checklists. These weren't anonymous statistics or acceptable losses in a larger strategic context. These were individuals with families and dreams and fears, people who'd trusted their lives to her professional competence. The altimeter continued its relentless countdown, 22,000 feet, and descending at a rate that made mockery of her efforts to arrest their fall. Physics were absolute, unforgiving of hope or determination, but physics could sometimes be negotiated with if you understood the terms of the bargain. She thought of Captain Chesley Sullenberger, who became a legend by successfully ditching U.S. Airways Flight 1549 in the Hudson River. The miracle on the Hudson had required perfect conditions, perfect execution, and luck that bordered on divine intervention. But most importantly, it had required a pilot who refused to accept that commercial airliners weren't designed to be boats. The Mediterranean was not the Hudson River. The water was colder, the rescue resources more scattered, the margin for error measured in degrees rather than miles. But the fundamental challenge remained the same. Convince 185 tons of aluminum and steel to behave like a watercraft for just long enough to give 180 people a chance at survival. The Navy fighter's pilot came on the radio again, his voice carrying the kind of professional concern that transcended service rivalries. Emirates 447, Surface winds are 15 knots from the southwest. Sea state appears moderate, swells running 3 to 4 feet. 3 to 4 foot swells. In a perfect world, that would be manageable. But perfect worlds didn't include hydraulic failures at 33,000 feet above open ocean. Nix keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "Copy that, Hawkeye. We're going to need all the help we can get." Help. The word tasted bitter in her mouth, because she knew that when the moment came, all the rescue assets in the Mediterranean wouldn't matter if she couldn't get the aircraft down in one piece. Admiral Blackwood watched the tactical display from the Roosevelt's Combat Information Center, each radar sweep bringing the wounded airliner closer to an impact point that her computers had calculated with merciless precision. The mathematics were unforgiving. Current rate of descent, distance to landfall, fuel remaining, sea conditions. Every variable pointed toward the same inevitable conclusion. "Ma'am, rescue birds are airborne," reported her Air Operations Officer, Commander Lisa Chen. "Two MH-60S helicopters and an MV-22 Osprey, ETA to projected impact zone 15 minutes. 15 minutes. Blackwood had commanded enough rescue operations to know that 15 minutes was an eternity when people were fighting for their lives in frigid water, and an instant when measured against the scope of coordinating emergency response assets across multiple countries. "What's the water temperature?" 16 degrees Celsius, ma'am. Survival time for unprotected individuals is estimated at 10 to 15 minutes. 10 to 15 minutes. Blackwood closed her eyes and thought of the 180 people aboard that aircraft, most of whom had probably never considered that their routine flight from Dubai to London might end with them floating in the Mediterranean, racing against hypothermia and the indifferent mathematics of human physiology. But she'd learned during 30 years of naval service that miracles occasionally happened when competent people refused to accept reasonable limitations. The pilot of that airliner, and she was almost certain it was a woman, based on the radio transmissions, was displaying the kind of controlled competence that came from extensive experience with crisis management. "Ma'am, we're receiving a transmission from Malta ATC," reported the communications officer. "They're coordinating with Italian and Greek coast guards, requesting all available surface assets to proceed to the projected impact zone." Blackwood nodded, watching the tactical display update in real time as rescue vessels across the central Mediterranean altered course toward a patch of empty ocean that would soon become either a graveyard or a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. Her career had been built on making command decisions with incomplete information, but this felt different. This felt personal, though she couldn't articulate why. Perhaps it was the professionalism in the pilot's voice, or the way the aircraft was being handled despite catastrophic system failures. Something about the situation reminded her of her own early flying days, when women in military aviation were still proving they belonged in cockpits that had been designed for men. "Admiral, I'm receiving requests from CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera for statements regarding the emergency," reported her public affairs officer. "Apparently, someone's been live-streaming the Navy fighters shadowing the airliner." Of course they had. In the age of social media and 24-hour news cycles, disasters became entertainment for people who would never understand the weight of command responsibility. But Blackwood had learned to ignore the noise and focus on what mattered, bringing people home alive. "No statements until the situation is resolved," she said firmly. "Our focus is on rescue operations, not public relations." Through the bridge windows, she could see aircraft launching from the carrier's deck, additional search and rescue assets, medical personnel, everything the Navy could bring to bear on a situation that would ultimately be decided by the skill of one pilot and the whims of physics. Lieutenant Commander Morrison had flown enough combat missions to recognize the moment when hope became mathematics, when the abstract possibility of survival transformed into the concrete calculus of impact angles and water temperature. The Emirates 777 was now at 18,000 feet and descending, its pilot fighting a battle that physics would eventually win. But something about the way the aircraft was being handled made him reluctant to write off the outcome as inevitable. The pilot's control inputs were becoming more pronounced as hydraulic pressure continued to bleed away, but they remained precise and purposeful. This wasn't random desperation. This was someone working through a problem with the methodical competence of extensive training. Home plate, Hawkeye 1-1. Request permission to descend and provide close escort during final approach. Admiral Blackwood's response came back immediately. Negative, Hawkeye. Maintain current altitude and coordinate with rescue assets. I don't want you down in the weeds if this goes bad. Morrison understood the logic, but it felt wrong to watch from altitude while someone fought the kind of battle that defined the finest moments of military aviation. The pilot of that airliner was displaying the kind of airmanship that transcended service rivalries and national boundaries, the universal language of competence under pressure that every aviator recognized and respected. His radio crackled with a transmission from the airliner, the pilot's voice still steady despite circumstances that would have reduced lesser aviators to panic. Hawkeye 1-1, Emirates 447. Can you give me a bearing to the rescue vessels? Morrison checked his tactical display, overlaying surface contacts with the airliner's projected impact point. The closest rescue ship was still 12 miles away, too far to matter given the aircraft's rate of descent, but close enough to provide psychological comfort in the final moments. Emirates 447, bearing 275, distance 12 miles. Coast Guard cutter and several fishing vessels converging on your position. Copy. We're going to try to stretch our glide toward the rescue assets. Try to stretch their glide. Morrison did the mathematics and felt his chest tighten with professional respect. The pilot was attempting something that bordered on aerodynamically impossible, using the airliner's mass and momentum to extract every possible foot of forward progress from their controlled descent. It was the kind of flight test technique that required intimate familiarity with aircraft performance envelopes. Emirates 447, what's your background? You're flying that heavy like you've done this before. A pause, longer than the others, as if the question had touched something personal. When the response came, it carried something Morrison hadn't heard before, not pride, but the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned their expertise in circumstances that civilian training couldn't provide. Former military, Hawkeye, been in worse situations. Former military. Morrison felt pieces clicking into place in his mind, the precision of the radio calls, the controlled competence under pressure, the way she was extracting performance from a dying aircraft that shouldn't have been possible according to the manufacturer's specifications. What airframe? Another pause. F-16, 3 combat deployments. Morrison felt his breath catch. F-16 pilots were a different breed, fighters who'd learned to think in 3 dimensions while pulling 9GS and dodging surface-to-air missiles. If anyone could nurse a wounded aircraft through an impossible situation, it would be someone who'd learned to fly in conditions where small mistakes had permanent consequences. Roger that, you've got this. Nix felt something loosen in her chest at the Navy pilot's words of confidence, not relief, because the situation remained unchanged, but the recognition that came from one professional acknowledging another's competence. It had been 3 years since she'd heard that particular tone in a pilot's voice, the unspoken fraternity of aviators who'd learned to trust each other's skills in conditions where trust was a luxury few could afford. 15,000 feet and descending. The Mediterranean stretched below them like a vast blue mirror, deceptively peaceful from altitude, but hiding currents and temperatures that would kill most of her passengers within minutes of impact. She could see fishing vessels converging on their projected crash site, white wakes tracing geometric patterns across water that would soon test every lesson she'd learned about survival in hostile environments. The control yoke felt like it weighed 200 pounds now, each input requiring the kind of physical effort that left her shoulders burning with lactic acid. Marcus had gone quiet beside her, his young face pale but focused, following emergency checklists with the mechanical precision of someone who needed procedures to maintain psychological equilibrium. Behind them, the cabin had settled into the eerie quiet that preceded crisis, 180 people processing their mortality with the dignity that ordinary humans displayed in extraordinary circumstances. She could hear children crying, adults praying, the rustle of life vests being positioned according to procedures that most passengers had ignored during the pre-flight safety briefing. Maria Santos's voice came through the intercom with professional calm that betrayed nothing of the terror she must be feeling. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened, tray tables stowed, and seats in their upright position. Remove all sharp objects from your pockets and prepare for emergency evacuation." Final approach. The phrase would have been routine on any other day, just another step in the ballet of commercial aviation that moved millions of people safely around the world. Today, it was a euphemism for controlled impact with water that might as well have been concrete at their closing speed. Nix thought of the last time she'd faced impossible mathematics, not as a commercial pilot following emergency procedures, but as Viper 62 leading a strike package through Syrian air defenses that shouldn't have been survivable. She'd brought her flight home that day by refusing to accept the reasonable limitations of aircraft performance, pushing her F-16 through flight envelopes that existed only in theoretical engineering discussions. The same instincts that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments were screaming now, not panic, but hyper-awareness of every variable that might influence the outcome. Wind speed and direction, water temperature, swell patterns, the precise angle of impact that would determine whether they had minutes or seconds before the aircraft broke apart. Hawkeye 11, Emirates 447. "We're going to try to put her down parallel to the swell pattern, minimize impact stress on the airframe." "Copy that, Emirates. Wind is 15 knots from the southwest, swells running southwest to northeast. You're lined up perfectly." Perfectly? She almost smiled at the irony. Nothing about this situation was perfect, but she'd learned long ago that perfection was a luxury that combat pilots couldn't afford. Sometimes adequate was enough. Sometimes adequate saved lives.